Welcome back, everyone. Our next presentation, titled On the Illusion of Separateness, the Interconnectedness of Human Experience, will be delivered remotely by Dr. Dean Radin, Chief Scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Dr. Radin has conducted groundbreaking research at the intersection of consciousness and quantum physics. Please give him a virtual round of applause.
Thank you very much. I will assume that you can hear me. So my talk is on the illusion of separation. What is reality? Reality is what I perceive, isn't it? Well, no. There are lots of ways of demonstrating that. Visual illusions are often used. So in this picture, it looks like there's a dark gray and a white color, but we can just start covering up this picture a little bit, and it doesn't take long before you realize that those two colors are actually exactly the same, the two gray colors. And the reason they look different is because we're biased by the surrounding images. On this one, if you keep your eyes focused on this X in the center, what you'll see on either side are very distorted human faces. But if you now move your eyes and you look at those faces, you'll see that they're people that you recognize. And so the reason this is happening is because when your fovea is in the center, you're getting high resolution there, but you're getting only partial images of what's going on in either side. Your brain doesn't know how to interpret it. So they look like little monsters. Here's another example. This looks like a Rubik's Cube, but it's actually a flat piece of paper. It's another way of fooling your eye and your brain as to what you're actually looking at. Here's another nice one. Listen, silent. What you see depends on your perspective. And here's yet another. It looks like these two boxes are stepping up and down, but they're actually going at the same speed. Again, our eye is fooling us because of the surrounding bars in the background that give this illusion. And one more illusion. In this case, you're asked to count the number of black dots that you see. And you'll find very quickly that although you see them in your peripheral vision, you can't focus on the black dots. They keep moving away because they're actually not there. And then this one, these ladies look perfectly normal until we turn it upside down. And we see that they don't look normal anymore. They look distorted because in the upside down stage, your brain is looking at this and saying, oh, I know what that is. And you project into it what you think these ladies look like, but they actually look like this. So what this tells us is that subjective and objective realities are not the same. We see what we expect to see, which a philosopher would call naive reality. Naive reality is a very thin slice of reality. So then what is real reality? Well, as we've already heard, we get a clue from physics about real reality. And this is about the transition of the classical to the quantum domains. So in the classical domain, we have words like locality and causality and a fixed reality and the feeling of being separate. In the quantum world, which is not really separate from the classical world, we have notions like non-locality and acausal relationships, a participatory reality, and we don't have space and time anymore. So there our everyday lives are a feeling of separateness at a deeper physical state where there is no separation at all. So there are other hints about what real reality may be like. And this is then a graph of different kinds of experiences that people have. So from mundane to profound and common to rare. So when you look at this kind of graph, you have people report things like gut feelings or intuitive hunches, the feeling of being stared at, telephone telepathy, distant knowing, distant healing, premonitions, creative insight, religious epiphany, and mystical union. So who reports this? Well, at the lower left here, everyone has these experiences. When they start moving up in the scale, we have people who are called healers and intuitives and geniuses, saints and yogis. So I call this a spectrum of the extended capacities of the mind. So these phenomena, especially in the upper right, only seem strange for one reason only. They suggest that the mind transcends space and time. The other thing strange about this is that at the upper right, these people, these geniuses, are very rare and beyond the reach of science to understand, but they're well accepted. By comparison, all of these so-called psychic experiences at the lower left are pretty common. They're easy to study, but they're highly controversial. So of the anomalies of human experience, we have geniuses, we have savants, including acquired savants, people who get savant ability simply by getting hit on the head one day, dissociative identity disorder, and at the bottom here, I'm putting psychic phenomena. So why psychic phenomena? Well, first of all, we're talking about telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and psychokinesis. And then another category we can call survival, which is like Marjorie was talking about as the near-death experience, suggesting that you don't actually need your brain to have some form of consciousness remain. So the psychic phenomena, telepathy, is some form of connection between people's minds. Psychokinesis is the imposition of your intention into the physical world. Clairvoyance is aspects of the physical world get into your mind from a distance. And precognition, that the aspects of the physical world get into your mind but slipped in time. These in general are called psi, which is just the first letter in the word psyche, the Greek word psyche, meaning mind or soul. Well, why would we want to study psi? Because first of all, it's a major challenge to the scientific status quo of reductive materialism, but also it can be rigorously studied using standard scientific methods in the laboratory. It also suggests that some aspect of consciousness is non-local in the quantum sense. The other thing is that these experiences are extremely common. We did a survey among psychic enthusiasts, asked them of 25 different kinds of psychic effects, which ones had they personally experienced? And then we asked the same question to the general population, and then scientists and engineers. And so, not surprisingly, among psychic enthusiasts, 99% report at least one of the psychic experiences, and on average, 13 out of 25. General population is 94%, 7.7 out of 25. And our surprise was that among scientists and engineers, 93% reports at least one psychic experience, and actually on average, 8.7 out of the 25 experiences. So these are quite common. You get a different response if you ask what people believe. We're asking what people have actually experienced. And so sometimes you get a difference between belief and experience because especially scientists and engineers are taught not to believe, even though they have the experience. So what are the mundane explanations? There's lots of ways that something can seem psychic but isn't. So probably about half of the experiences that people have are really just coincidence. And then another big chunk is confabulation, and there's fraud occasionally, selective memory, but there's always something left over. And that's where my interest lies. It's this something else that doesn't fit any of the normal explanations. So let's look at an example of how we would study telepathy in a laboratory. So the most popular method that's been developed over the past 50 years is called the Ganzfeld telepathy test. And so you'd have someone play a role of a receiver of telepathic information. And the Ganzfeld involves putting a red light so that shines in their face, and then putting a ping pong ball that is cut in half over each eye. And you ask them to keep their eyes open. And now you give them headphones that play white noise. So they can't see anything, they can't hear anything, but they're not going to sleep either. So in that state, you have a distant sender who's isolated from the receiver, was shown a random target, usually a picture or maybe a video clip. And so the job of the sender is to look at that random target and then send it, connect in some way to the mind of the receiver. And so you would hope that after a while, the receiver begins to, in this case, pick up that there's something about a bunny. Another example, maybe the target is an elephant. So in the experiment itself, again, he's trying to send this thing about an elephant, but the receiver is asked to speak aloud any impression that they have, whether very subtle or obvious, to speak aloud. In this case, maybe they would pick up something about an animal who might be gray. And so the receiver is then taken out of the Ganzfeld condition. Anything that they said is played back, and they see 4 images. So these are created in advance. Only one of them was selected as the actual target. And so you can see that the chance that they would correctly select the elephant as being the target is 1 in 4, because they have no idea which one is correct. And so by chance, they can only get it correct 1 in 4 times. And so here's an actual experiment that we ran in our lab. So this is our shielded room, our shielded chamber. It's 2,000 pounds, solid steel walls, double walled, and grounded. So it's a Faraday cage. So we put the receiver in there, and this is our participant named Gail. And this was my research assistant who is putting the ping pong balls over Gail's eyes. And meanwhile, elsewhere in the building, we have a person who is shown one of these 4 pictures. So this was selected at random for these 4 pictures, and that person was told to mentally send that image to Gail. So this is then what Gail said. Something has a rough texture. Tall, looking up high, like in an art gallery or in a museum. A Yosemite kind of image of a tall rock. Yosemite is, of course, a famous national park in the United States with a gigantic rock. It's monolithic, images of Mount Rushmore, again, giant rocks, and Half Dome, another big rock, like a big stone. So that's all that she said in a period of around 20 minutes. That's the impressions that she got. So if you were a judge in this experiment and you knew these were 4 possible pictures, one of which was being mentally sent to Gail, which one would you select? Well, Gail selected this one. And in fact, that was the target. So this is an example of a single session in a Ganzfeld experiment that took about 90 minutes from beginning to end, and this is a hit. So if we look at the question that often comes up is, well, that's an interesting case, but are these experiments independently repeatable, says Skeptic Dog. Well, if you look at places that have done this particular kind of experiment, they've been going on a long time in a lot of different universities and private institutes. And when you look at the entire body of experiments, these are 122 experiments, all using the same method, all using 4 different images, 20 laboratories, and 4,674 sessions, of which the one with Gail was 1 session. So there's a lot of data. So this is what the 122 experiments look like. And what you see here, each dot is the mean hit rate, and these are the error bars. The error bars differ from one experiment to the other because you could have a small experiment, so you have big error bars, or an experiment with lots and lots of trials like this one, where you have very small error bars. And so now the question is, well, how does all of this compare to chance? And that's what you'd use in meta-analysis for. So with the meta-analysis, you can combine all of these into one gigantic experiment, and we end up over here. This is around 32% hit rate, and you see how far away it is from chance. The odds against chance of ending up there, as compared to chance, which would be 25%, is 300 trillion quadrillion to 1. That's 3 times 10 to the minus 30th. What's interesting is that because we're looking at this cumulatively, this is a stable effect that we're seeing that's roughly 20 years long, because these experiments have been going on a long time. And so we're narrowing down to an overall hit rate of about 32%, where by chance you'd expect only 25%. That difference means that some information got into the receiver's head under very strict conditions where they shouldn't get any information at all. So that's a sign of telepathy. This has been discussed extensively in the academic psychology literature. Psychological Bulletin is one of the top-tier journals in psychology. Starting in 1994 up to a couple of years ago, repeatedly presenting new data and having dialogues and criticisms published. So the thing to keep in mind is that if the odds are 300 trillion quadrillion to 1, it would take longer than the lifetime of the universe to get these results by pure chance. That's because if you look at the 4,000 some sessions and add up the amount of time it actually took to produce that, in this case it took 4 or 5 decades and many laboratories, it would take that times 300 trillion quadrillion to get the results by chance. So what are the alternative explanations? Well, the usual ones are sensory leakage. Somehow information got to the receiver through ordinary means, through recording mistakes, randomization problems, experimental quality variation, selective reporting, fraud. All of the ones on the top here are taken care of by the design and the protocol of the experiment. A lot of attention is paid to make sure that these are not viable explanations. But an underlying question is, well, what if a skeptic does this study? And the idea is that maybe all these studies are done by believers and they somehow bias the results. Well, what about skeptics? Well, this went unanswered until 2005 when 2 professors of psychology, both of whom said explicitly in their article that they did not believe in any kind of psychic effect, they nevertheless went ahead and did a Ganzfeld experiment, and they reported after 8 studies, we had an overall statistically significant hit rate of 32%, which, as you've already seen, is the average hit rate that you get when people do this study. And then they said, well, this is precariously close to demonstrating humans do have psychic powers. And they didn't like that at all, because they, of course, started out with the idea that psychic abilities don't exist. But to their credit, they published this anyway. So this was reviewed more recently using Bayesian statistical methods, which is an alternative way of looking at this. And this is the Ganzfeld and a number of other kinds of experiments. The point here is that using a Bayesian method, you end up with a Bayes factor of 18 million to 1. And that's interesting because for a Bayes factor that is 200 to 1 is considered decisive evidence in favor of the hypothesis. So this is a little bit more than 200 to 1. It's 18 million to 1, showing that even from a Bayesian perspective, if you prefer that method of statistics, there's no question that this body of data is showing a real effect. Even prominent skeptics who are aware of this data admit that something interesting is happening. Richard Wiseman is a well-known skeptic in the UK, and he has said, I think that these studies do meet the usual standards for a normal claim, except that he considers telepathy not to be a normal claim because it's not yet well accepted by science. So as of 2020, there have been 117 studies published after the earliest pilot tests, so about 3,800 sessions. These are studies and sessions that were done under extremely strict conditions and provided a slightly lower hit rate, 30.6%, but it still gives you a 10 to the minus 16th probability, the odds of 10,000 trillion to 1. So the interesting thing about this is the vast majority of people involved in these experiments were unselected college students. If you then go to a subset of artistic participants, creative participants, writers, artists, that sort of thing, they get a 41% hit rate. So this has been well known in the field that people who tend to be creative and open-minded, and especially artists, tend to get much higher hit rates in these kinds of experiments. So those odds of 10 billion to 1, even though there's much fewer number of people, only 367 people, were still able to get a very strong result. You can do the same experiment looking at correlations in brain activity. So in conventional neuroscience, this is called an experiment in hyperscanning, where you look at similarities in brain responses when two people or more are doing the same thing. Except in this experiment, you actually separate people so they're not connected at all. They're not in the same location. And you do a stimulus to one, like a light flash, and you look at the brain of the other person. So by any conventional reason, you shouldn't find that there are correlations, but in fact there are. So Skeptic Cat says, really? There really are these psychic abilities? Well, we look at expert opinion. So here's the president of the American Statistical Association in 2016, in which he said as part of her lecture that year, was that the data in support of precognition and possibly other related psychic phenomena are quite strong statistically and would be widely accepted if they pertain to something more mundane, which again is pointing at the idea that this is not well accepted by science yet because we don't have an explanation that everyone would agree is the right explanation. But the data, and analyzed statistically, shows that these effects are quite strong. 2018, in the American Psychologist, which is the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association, Edsel Cardenio, who's a professor at Lund University, wrote that the evidence for psi, different kinds of psychic abilities, is comparable to that for established phenomena in psychology and other disciplines. It's quite clear from an empirical perspective. So what's going on? So the standard neuroscience today basically is theory is that you're nothing but a pack of neurons and you're a machine made of meat. That's a classical physics way of thinking about what's going on here. And from that perspective, it's really difficult to understand why any of this makes any sense at all. And so it doesn't make any sense unless consciousness is fundamental in some way. And that is the second major theory, as we've already discussed, that something about consciousness is fundamental, meaning it is more fundamental than physics. It's primary over physics. From that perspective, these kinds of experiences make a lot of sense. So why isn't this in the scientific mainstream? The evidence is very clear. Well, there's a long-term stigma and taboo. There are both scientific objections and religious objections, at least in the Western world. There's a belief among many scientists that the phenomena are literally impossible. And I would call that an ideational illusion. It's an illusion because the phenomena clearly are possible using the same methods of science that any other discipline uses. So it's an idea that it can't be possible based on a certain worldview. It's an ideational illusion. It's also willful ignorance. A lot of scientists who say this is impossible, they don't even bother to look at the data. But fortunately, major changes are underway. So why is it important to study these phenomena? Well, one reason is that the scientific worldview of materialism overlooks very important aspects of reality. So it fails to answer important questions like, who are we? And what are our potentials? We have blinders. As I said, change is coming. Marjorie mentioned that one of the thought leaders in mainstream neuroscience is Christoph Koch, and he has very significantly changed his original opinion into the opinion of idealism, which basically says that consciousness is fundamental. And you find this going way back. So this is Arthur Eddington in the 1920s, who was already saying it's difficult for the matter-of-fact physicist to accept the view that the substratum of everything is of mental character. 2005, in Nature, of course, one of the top 2 scientific journals in the world, we have this article on the mental universe. The only reality is mind and observations, but observations are not of things. To see the universe as it really is, we must abandon our tendency to conceptualize observations as things. So again, he repeats what Eddington says. Physicists shy from the truth because the truth is so alien to everyday physics. And ultimately, everything is mind. Then here we have in 2018, I think, in Scientific American, the question is not whether quantum theory is correct, but what it means. And it means that there's a primary role for mind in nature. That is not the only interpretation of quantum mechanics, but it is a major one. It is a minority, but a large minority is beginning to believe that this is actually the case. Primary role for mind in nature. So we're beginning to pull back the curtain from Alice in Wonderland, and we're seeing the Matrix behind it. And so I'm a little bit ahead of time, but I'm going to stop there so we can continue. And I thank you very much for your attention.